49% of millennials have a positive view of socialism, which was actually more millennials than had a positive view of capitalism in that same poll. Merriam-Webster, the dictionary, reported that socialism was the most searched for word of 2015 on their online dictionary. And over the past several months, we've seen a candidate for president openly run as a self-proclaimed democratic socialist and be greeted with massive amounts of enthusiasm and support. Now, I think we can have a rich discussion and debate on the limitations of pop stars and presidential candidates taking up these causes, but just considering how frequently maligned and dismissed both feminism and socialism are in our society, I think this wave of enthusiasm is something for us to celebrate. It also gives us an opportunity to kind of reconsider the relationship, or what we know about the relationship between feminism and socialism. Because there's also a long history of erasing the contributions that feminists have made to Marxist theory, as well as the role that Marxism has played in advancing theories of women's liberation, which leads many to assume that socialism and feminism are made up these two gendered silos with kind of boisterous brocialists on one side and fun-slaying feminazis on the other side. These caricatures, to be fair, maybe they aren't without some shreds of truth to them. A tension has existed between feminists and socialists at times. And the women's movement of the 1960s and 70s began in part due to the fact that women on the left were usually relegated to grunt work, denied leadership positions, and literally shouted down when they tried to bring women's issues to the fore. And feminism, in the hands of bourgeois power feminists, has failed time and time again to center the concerns of the vast majority of women on this planet. So tonight, I'm going to take a page out of Chimamanga's book, and I'm going to argue that we should all be feminists, and we should all be socialists, because the structure of women's oppression is woven so deeply into the fabric of capitalism that we cannot be free until we replace it with a system that no longer prioritizes profit over human need. I think if we're going to fight women's oppression, we should think about where it comes from. And there's many pervasive myths about why women are oppressed and, the origins of our oppression. And we hear them over and over again in our daily lives, and sometimes even within our movements when we're trying to organize to change things for the better. So we're told from the time that we're very young that gender inequality is based on the natural order of things, right? That women are naturally nurturing and passive, perfectly designed to carry out the work of raising children and caring for the home, while men are naturally dominating and aggressive to do the rough and tumble work of providing for the family. And we're also taught that these ingrained characteristics make us unfit to do the work of the opposite gender. Now, we know this is bullshit, right? Everyone hears that a feminism and socialism talk, so I assume, yeah, we agree, this is bullshit. But how do we know that? We know that through our own lived experience. I know that from my own lived experience of, watching my big, burly, hard-talking South Boston-raised father lose his mind whenever there's a baby in the room. And I'm sure you can think of people in your lives who, break barriers in terms of gendered expectations as well, or even yourself, perhaps. We also know that these particular stereotypes have never described the experiences of people who experience racial oppression on top of gender-based oppression. And they don't even acknowledge the existence of trans, intersex people, literally everyone outside of the gender binary. These stereotypes are not a reflection of reality, they're actually an ideology. Another pervasive myth about women's oppression is that gender inequality has been a constant throughout human history. That we're always making progress and eroding these ideas, and that women's status today is the best we've ever had it throughout all of time. And this happens in some really casual ways. I think we've all seen the image of the caveman with his club over his shoulder and then dragging a cave woman by her hair with his other hand. And it also happens in more formalized ways. Eleanor Burke Leacock, a Marxist anthropologist, notes that even among highly trained anthropologists, the polarization of public male authority and private female influence is taken as a given of the human condition. So even people who are professionally trained to study human society and to try to remove their blinders from their own culture, we still see this really pervasive research bias. She goes on to say that women are commonly stated or implied in anthropological research to hold low status in one or another society without benefit of empirical documentation, which she attributes in part to problems arising from interpretations of data in terms of Western concepts and assumptions. In other words, and now this may shock you, but in a field where women and other oppressed groups were excluded from participating in except as research subjects, researchers never really bothered to even wonder whether gender equality had ever existed in human history at all. But happily, that started to change a little bit, and there have been some more interrogations into the historical record around this question about whether, maybe gender equality existed in human history. And there is evidence of egalitarian pre-class societies where women's political power, women's work, the standards of sexuality we live under, and the structure of motherhood look very different from what they do today, and in fact, gave women greater control over their own lives. Even in societies where there was a division of labor along gendered lines, it did not automatically translate into an unequal power structure in terms of access to political power and group decision-making. Feminist anthropologist Judith Brown argues that because women controlled the planting and cultivating in Iroquois societies, they commanded a great deal of authority, even over men's activities. It was not only the domestic realm that the matrons controlled the dispensing of food. By supplying the essential provisions for male activities, the hunt, the warpath, and the council, they were able to control these to some degree. There are also examples of women enjoying a great deal of sexual freedom in their relationships, like this example from an 18th century Jesuit missionary describing a conversation that he had on the importance of women's purity with a man from the Montagnais Naskapi tribe of eastern Canada. And so this is this 18th century Jesuit missionary. I told him that it was not honorable for a woman to love anyone else except her own husband, and that, this evil being among them, he himself was not sure that his son, who was there present, was in fact his son. The man replied, "Thou hast no sense. You French people love only your own children, but we love all the children of our tribe." I think there's such a stunning difference in that example between that attitude and the sexual standards that our culture puts on girls and women today. If you had a woman who didn't necessarily know the paternity of a child today, she would just be slut-shamed into oblivion. And also to say about the expectations around, men's role in caring for children as well. It's just a total cultural disconnect here. So what changed? Why did women experience such broad range of freedom in these societies relative to what we do today? How and when did these bullshit gender norms ossify into a global system of oppression? And this is where I think some Marxist methodology is really helpful in clarifying the question. So Marx's basic premise was that the mode of production, or the way that people organize with each other to produce their subsistence, the technologies they use, and corresponding forms of labor, determine the kind of social organization they have. So we start to see widespread women's oppression emerge in human history as a direct result of one of these shifts in the mode of production, when societies moved from producing their subsistence through hunting and gathering to producing subsistence through agriculture. So agriculture, this technological advancement allowed groups to produce more resources than ever before and led to a massive shift in the conditions of human life. Where before you may have been tasked with gathering food to last a day or two, now communities could grow enough food to last them for months at a time. They could develop a surplus of resources for future use or for trade. And with the development of this surplus came the question of how to distribute it. And this question resolved itself in different ways across different cultures, but in many early agricultural societies, a trend developed where the people who produced a little bit more relative to their neighbors got to have a little bit more say in how everything was distributed. So under certain circumstances, the exercise of power by the redistributor on one side and by the ordinary food producers on the other became so imbalanced that for all intents and purposes, the redistributor chiefs constituted the principal coercive social force in society. This development, where a relatively small group of people have power over the distribution of the surplus, while a relatively large group of people perform the labor to create the surplus, is the origin of class divisions. And Marxists understand classes as defined by their relationship to the production and control of society's wealth, in particular to the surplus product. So we still see this dynamic today, right? When working class people go into work every day, we sell our labor to a boss who compensates us with a set wage, while the products we make are sold on the market. If a profit's produced, it's the boss who gets to decide how it's spent, and much of the time, that profit goes into the boss's pocket. Most workers produce far more wealth than they ever earn and are never compensated for the difference. So what does this have to do with women's oppression, this whole thing of agriculture and this class divisions and well, as class differences are established following the onset of agriculture, so too was gender inequality. While hunter-gatherer societies had an incentive to limit women's reproduction, a surplus meant communities could support more people than ever before, and the more workers a community had, the greater a surplus could be produced. So demand for labor increased. And societies no longer sought to limit pregnancies as they had before. In this moment, women's reproductive capacities took on a new centrality to their lives and to their oppression. This led to what the early stages of what feminists often refer to as the separate spheres of public and private life. So this new economic situation compelled women to specialize in the private work of housekeeping and child raising, while men who couldn't give birth generally specialized in the work of agriculture and animal domestication. This new labor system, rigidly divided by gender, is one of the central components of women's oppression. And there's another piece of women's oppression that arises around this same time, the nuclear family. So the nuclear family developed first among property-owning people as a way to trace lineage and pass property on to the next generation. Women's primary role in these families was to marry well, stay monogamous, and produce male heirs who would inherit the family's estate. The nuclear family soon also became the dominant kinship form among the working class as well. So for women in non-property owning families, their primary role was to marry young and reproduce as many workers as possible. While caring for children in the household may have been a communal project in the past, it now rested squarely on the shoulders of individual families, and because of newly gendered specializations of labor, on women in particular. So as I was writing this part of the talk, I kept thinking about that expression that we have around it takes a village to raise a child. But here we see in this moment how this change in the mode of production creates a shift where the village is divided up in such a way that it no longer provides basic services for its children. Instead, it's up to individual families to produce the food, shelter, healthcare, and childcare necessary for their individual unit to survive. And we see opportunities for these individual units to start getting pitted against each other because these units are not the people who are controlling the surplus here. And this shift is a particularly egregious injustice to the working class when we think back on the point I made earlier about how profit is created. So profit is the result of unpaid labor, the exploitation of working class people. Working class women, by having children, create more workers who in all likelihood spend their lives working long hours for a menial wage, which in turn creates more profit for the ruling class. And how are working class women compensated for providing the food, shelter, healthcare, and childcare to the army of workers that create the ruling class's wealth? Well, of course we aren't. We aren't compensated for it all. We're expected to cover these costs. We provide the ruling class with the source of their profit, and for that service, we are sent the bill. So many schools of feminism focus on resolving the economic relationship between men and women. But here we see another relationship of pivotal importance to women's lives, the economic relationship between women and capital. When we look at women's oppression in this way, we see how unpaid domestic labor provides a service not merely to male members of the household, but to the ruling class itself. We see it's the ruling class that reaps the most benefit from this sexist setup, and we see how working class men today have a shared material interest in ending women's oppression. Because the conditions of women's oppression negatively impact all working class people. And we see this in the divide between important public work and trivial private work. This divide totally persists to this day, and it means that no one is compensated for work performed in the home. The devaluing of feminized labor means crucial occupations like nursing, teaching, childcare, and social work are still generally low status, low paying jobs. And though the state has taken on some of the work that used to be provided solely in the home, like education, people of all genders, less so now though, they took it on, but we see this total assault on public education right now. Anyway, side note, so it's not necessarily a given it's going to stay that way, but, people of all genders continue to suffer from the destruction of this communal structure of care that the nuclear family replaced. And people who do not have supportive or stable homes to fall back on suffer most of all. And here's where we see how this intersects with, a lot of times with other forms of oppression. And perhaps the most tragic victims under the system that does such a piss-poor job of meeting our basic needs are children. And Eleanor Leacock, the anthropologist that I was talking about earlier, notes how much children lost as a result of this shift to the nuclear family from a communal-based structure of care. One result of the breaking up of large, extended families into smaller units based on a married couple and their children was that the circle of people upon whom the children depended began to shrink. As we see that circle shrink of people that children can depend on, we also see circles of support for parents shrinking and circles of support for parents being destroyed. And in the place, there's something that grows, and I think what grows there is this heartbreaking shame and stigma among parents who are simply not paid enough to fully provide for their children, who then go through cycles of self-blame, who are blamed by society for their inability to care for their children. And this has serious effects on the mental health and wellness of the entire family, and I think affects working class families in particular. So I wanted to spend a fair amount of time in my talk kind of talking about the origins of women's oppression because I think they're very important. I think when we identify the origins of our oppression and we understand where our oppression comes from, it informs how we fight back. Without a clear political stance on the origins of our oppression and the conditions that continue to reproduce them in our lives today, without a clear sense of who our enemies and who our allies are in this fight, feminists and socialists alike risk being sucked into the existing power structure, never mounting a serious challenge to oppression, and thus undermining our own goals for liberation. When we throw our energy, for instance, behind bourgeois feminisms that lack class analysis, we can wind up supporting some seriously unfeminist initiatives. Consider how the Feminist Majority Foundation, in the wake of 9/11, helped build support among its liberal base for the invasion of Afghanistan by spreading the idea that the Bush administration was going to war in part to liberate women. So the Bush administration is not, they're not concerned with liberating women in America. So seriously, we're white knighting it all the way over there to liberate the women of Afghanistan. Come on. Anyway, whatever. It happened. They did it. And it did. There were people who, this was I think we can laugh now because this was in the wake of a serious national tragedy, and I think the attitude at the time was it was different now than it is now. But so a lot of people did go along with this, and a lot of self-proclaimed feminists did. Anyway, so after George W. held his infamous mission accomplished photo op, Feminist Majority Foundation even circulated a petition thanking his administration for its commitment to restoring the rights of women in Afghanistan. Now, while the war did transform life for the women of Afghanistan, it certainly did not liberate them. As Miriam Rawi of the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan argued in 2004, the U.S. has replaced one misogynistic fundamentalist regime with another. And local struggles for gender justice in Iraq were similarly undermined by the U.S. occupation there, which was also justified under the auspices of freeing women, of liberating women. And Jeanette Al-Ghezi of the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq Now says in this interview, "The violence here goes on and on. There's a sector of society that is deeply impacted by this, especially liberatory feminist women. Why do I feel that the United States played such a decisive role in this? Because when they came in 2003, they were the main engines of empowerment for the Islamic political parties that rule now." Now, I'm willing to bet that the fact that liberatory Iraqi feminists do in fact exist would come as a big surprise to many of the Western bourgeois feminists concerned with helping women in the Middle East. And, I think what also would come to a big surprise to them is that when these feminists organize on their own terms, their visions for liberation go well beyond any goals that bourgeois feminists would pursue on their behalf. And we see the same sort of disconnect between bourgeois feminism and the grassroots struggle for abortion rights here in the United States. Pro-choice establishment feminists have shifted their energies away from movements, instead pouring their considerable resources into influencing Congress members. As the fight has moved out of the streets, where we are free to talk about reproductive justice on our own terms, and into the Capitol, the conversation has been dragged so far to the right that the only abortion stories presented are the most extreme cases of need. And when only the most extreme cases of need are presented, abortion becomes collectively understood as an act of desperation instead of an act of liberation, which, for the 95% of people who, after having an abortion, said it was the right decision for them at the time, it most assuredly is. And the reason that bourgeois power feminists are not interested in taking up a truly liberatory program for women isn't because they are blinded by their considerable privilege. It's because true liberation for all women is a direct threat to the profit model which they rely upon to fund their personal lifestyles and professional projects. Because when working class women start to organize for our own lives, we demand much more than just abortion rights. We challenge privatized structures of healthcare, education, childcare, and housing. We make demands for environmental justice, for ending racist police violence, for closing prisons and opening borders. We make these types of demands because these are the issues that press down on working class women's lives in real and serious ways. And these issues affect ruling class feminist lives as well, because this is how they make their fortunes. As entrepreneurial leaders within the existing power structure, they will resist efforts to undercut their material interests as fiercely as we do ours. When our demands threaten their profits, we cannot expect these types of feminists to stand on our side. As oppressed people, our best chance at mounting a serious challenge to those who stand in the way of our liberation is by organizing alongside those who share our material interests in changing the system and who have the potential power to overthrow it, the working class. The working class is the only class in society with the power to challenge capitalism, because it is the workers who have their hands on the levers of industry. When we withhold labor collectively, together we can bring profit to a standstill and force the ruling class to truly reckon with our demands. Uniting the working class means overcoming centuries of ruling class ideology that undermines our confidence and divides us along lines of race, gender, sexuality, nationality, ability, the list goes on and on. As Lenin argued in 1902, Marxists must respond to all cases of oppression, violence, and abuse, no matter what class is affected. And this argument has been made more recently as well, especially by Black feminists, like those in the Combahee River Collective, who wrote in their organizational statement, "We realize that the liberation of all oppressed people necessitates the destruction of the political, economic systems of capitalism and imperialism, as well as patriarchy. We are socialists because we believe that work must be organized for the collective benefit of those who do the work and create the products, not for the profit of the bosses. Material resources must be equally distributed among those who create these resources. We are not convinced, however, that a socialist revolution that is not also a feminist and an anti-racist revolution will guarantee our liberation." Socialists who refuse to take seriously the concerns of women, people of color, LGBTQ people, and other oppressed groups are irrelevant. Struggles for socialism must cultivate unity and solidarity in order to stand a chance in the fight against capitalism. And they will fail to do so if they do not prioritize advancing struggles against oppression alongside struggles related to class. And throughout history, we can see possibilities of revolutionary self-emancipation of workers from below, as well as examples of the roles that women can play in the uprising of all oppressed and exploited people. And I'm going to close out my section of the talk before we get into the discussion section with one of my favorite examples of this, which comes from a Bolshevik machinist on the eve of the Russian Revolution in 1917. On the morning of February 23rd, one could hear women's voices in the lane, which the windows of our department overlooked. Down with the war, down with high prices, down with hunger, bread for the workers. Myself and several comrades were at the windows in a flash. The gates of the factory were wide open. Masses of women workers filled the lane, and their mood was militant. Those who caught sight of us began to wave their arms, shouting, "Come out, quit work!" Snowballs flew in through the window. We decided to join the demonstration. A brief meeting took place outside the main office near the gates, and we poured out into the street. The comrades in front were seized by the arms amidst shouts of "Hooray!" and we set off with them down the street. This demonstration that started, there was a lot of work that happened before this demonstration, but this demonstration that started as a demonstration of women workers culminated in workers in Russia overthrowing the Tsar and, for a brief time, replacing one of the most repressive power structures in human history with a revolutionary government that established full social and political equality for women. And remember, this is 1917. Here's what demands were won for women after the revolution, after the Tsar was overthrown. In 1917, they won the right to vote and hold office, the right to file for divorce, the principle of equal pay for equal work, paid maternity leave for 4 months before and after childbirth, childcare at the government's expense. Abortion was made legal 3 years later in 1920, and abortions were provided free of cost for women who obtained them in state hospitals. Only those who performed abortions for profit were considered criminals. Today, mainstream feminists are calling on women to improve their social status by closing the confidence gap between the sexes. I would like to argue that if we really want to see serious change in women's political, social, and economic power, we should focus much more energy on closing the confidence gap that exists between today's working class and the working class on that day in revolutionary Russia.